He's not on the list, but Luca Brasi wants to see you.
Is this necessary?
Vito Corleone was the most powerful and feared mob boss in the world, but there was even a man that he actually feared. This man was one of the most ruthless psychopathic enforcers to live at the time, and was an uncontrollable man. Even Don Corleone feels on edge when he's in the presence of Brasi. Once Luca leaves the room after speaking to Don Vito during the wedding, Vito lets out a small sigh of relief that shows his angst. The book goes on to say that this was the only man in the world who could make Vito nervous, which is saying quite a lot. But how did the personal enforcer to Vito Corleone garner this feared reputation, and what made him so scary? Let's take a deeper dive into some of these stories that aren't told in the film. Luca Brasi was born in 1894 in Rhode Island, an Italian, and was subject to a rough childhood. He was beaten by his alcoholic father frequently growing up, and at a certain point he had endured enough. He killed his father after his dad forced Luca's mom to have a miscarriage by stabbing her in the abdomen, thus marking his first act of terror. Luca continued this behavior by killing one of his neighbors, pushing him off the roof because he got his mother pregnant. Like I said, he was kind of a psychopath, and this is just the beginning. He was introduced early in the first film at Vito's daughter's wedding. He is seen talking to himself, rehearsing what he was going to say to the Don. You can tell that Luca is nervous to speak to the Don and tells him that he pledges his ever-ending loyalty and that he's honored and grateful to be invited. A little bit later in the wedding, Kay asks how he knows Johnny Fontaine, a famous singer at the time. Michael goes on to explain that Johnny was serviced to a band leader and was under contract, but wanted to get out of his role. Vito then went to the band leader, offering $10,000 to be released from the contract, but the band leader said no. So the next day, Vito came back, but with Luca Brasi, and as Michael describes it,
Luca Brasi held a gun to his head, and my father assured him that either his brains or his signature would be on the contract.
If I was the band leader, I'd probably take up that deal, which he did do, and Johnny was freed from the contract. This story Michael tells shows the pure intimidating factor Luca possesses. In the book, he is described as having a face that was stamped into a mask of fury, and his eyes were brown with no warmth of the color, more of a deadly tan. A little later on in the film, Luca is summoned by Vito to try to get some information on Virgil Sollozzo and the Tattaglias by having Brasi seem like he's switching sides. He went to Bruno Tattaglia's nightclub and complained about being held down in the family. Brasi met with Bruno and Sollozzo, where they offered him a job, $50,000 worth. As you know, Luca is then stabbed, and an assassin comes from behind and chokes him to death with a rope. And that's the last we see of Luca. But that's not the whole story of Luca. There's some deep, disturbing stories of him that show who he really was. There was a story Michael didn't know, because it was, quote, so terrible that even Vito wouldn't talk about it. Let's look into these stories. When Vito was rising to power, he proposed an offer on business to a man named Salvatore Maranzano, an equal partnership where both parties would benefit. But unfortunately, Maranzano denied this offer with contempt, which would then spark the Great War of 1933. Maranzano was good friends with Al Capone and called him to put a hit out on Vito. Little did he know that Vito had a man in his pocket by the name of Luca Brasi. The gunmen were sent to take out Vito, but the Corleone family had friends in Chicago who relayed the news that the hitmen were coming by train. He then sent Brasi and his men to take care of these individuals. One of Brasi's men obtained a taxi, and the other acted as a station porter taking the hitman's bags to the taxi. Once inside, they drove them to a nearby warehouse, where Luca proceeded to do the most heinous of acts possible. Luca chopped one of the men into pieces and gagged his mouth to prevent him from crying out. He proceeded to bleed out everywhere, with body pieces being scattered all over the floor. The second hitman saw what Brasi did, and out of complete terror, swallowed the bath towel he was gagged with and suffocated. This act of terror echoed through the mob world at the time, and showed Luca's ruthlessness and the fear he instilled in others. Another event Luca is known for is his killing spree that put an end to the Olive Oil War. Vito was at a festival where 6 men came to take care of him, and one of them shot and almost killed him during this war and hospitalized Vito. This hit on Vito was huge during the war, and it seemed Maranzano now had the upper hand on the Corleones. But the thing is, They had Luca Brasi on their side, and once he was unleashed, he was unstoppable. Brasi went on to kill those 6 men in a span of 2 weeks by himself. And if Vito didn't call him off, he was bound to continue his rampage. And in the end, there was no need to, since this killing spree ended the olive oil war for good and ascended the Corleone crime family to the top of the mob world. This deed by Luca shows his true nature and why he was so feared. Imagine going to war with someone, and you hear that his personal enforcer has committed these acts of violence. I bet the majority of people would reconsider their choice in going to war. As ruthless as those stories were, this next one is definitely more terrifying than the previous 2. This is the story I mentioned earlier that Michael couldn't know because it was so terrible. In the book, this story is told to Michael by a midwife who was at the scene when this happened. In the early 1930s, Luca Brasi met a girl named Kelly who became his girlfriend. He was extremely possessive of his girlfriend and almost killed Tom Hagen for sleeping with her, even though he didn't know she was involved with Brasi. Eventually, Luca got her pregnant and wanted her to have an abortion, but she refused. On the night of his son being born, he went to a midwife's lady named Filomena for assistance. Because of his reputation, she was extremely nervous of him, and she reluctantly obliged after he threw money at her to help. Now, once the child had been born, Kelly was exhausted and went into a deep sleep. Brasi turned to Filomena saying, "I don't want any of that race to live." He then shockingly told the midwife to take it into the basement and throw it in the furnace. Obviously, she denied this absurd request, but Brasi wasn't taking no for an answer. He violently thrust it at the newborn, crushing it against Filomena's chest. He then threatened to cut her throat if she didn't do it, telling her, "I'll make you filthy rich." She explains that she was so scared the next thing she remembered was being downstairs in front of the furnace. Brasi asked if she did it, and she nodded. On top of this, Brasi also murdered his girlfriend Kelly 2 days later and was arrested by police. This story shows Brasi's twisted nature and why he was so feared by everyone. This proves he's a psychopath and explains why not even Vito could talk about this heinous story. Now, once he went to prison, Brasi didn't work for Vito at the time, and Vito tried to set the matter straight to have Brasi released. But as he was doing this, Brasi tried to commit suicide in his cell. He was sent to the hospital and survived. Vito then ended up pulling some strings, and Luca was released, and Luca remained loyal to the Don ever since. And that's the video. What do you think about Luca Brasi? Did you expect him to be this wicked and ruthless? These stories of Luca definitely made me look at him in a different way, and this may truly be the most ruthless character in the films. Comment below your thoughts of him. Thanks for watching and subscribe.